당연히 그지 타바 토야기 아니 람 림레 제발라 아주 타바 돈이 somebody 아주 타바 somebody 기고 그래서 진짜 타바 돈이 somebody 기와라 아주 가르고 버스네 아니 코비기 첼이야 아니 귀엔도 따고 그래서 진짜 귀엔 통화 있나 진짜디네 델레 타르도기 somebody 그래서 델레 동아딜레 코발레 타고도 선배 somebody 와나 얘네 타바 토고 선배 타바 돈이 somebody 리기리에서 다디 타바 돈이 somebody 얘기 된다라 아주 그 코비기 당아주 코비기 나다 저기 그새 동아 마스 밀리네 다 냐와 이다 둔조 하다미 내다 녀모 코와 끼위게 간시네 동아이랑 시리에서지 다 디고셔와 그새 좀
Good evening. Last week we continued to look at this presentation of the practices that are shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity, seeing how that in order to give rise to the appropriate motivation, the motivation where one's committed to attaining liberation from suffering, where every thought and thereby every activity is motivated by the wish to ensure that this activity brings about freedom, one has to reflect repeatedly and in detail on the faults of samsara. And we saw that there's a proportional relationship between the clarity with which we see how suffering pervades all experiences with samsara and the strength of our motivation, the strength of our wish to strive for and achieve liberation. And thereby we also came to see that the suffering experiences of samsara are accumulated by our afflictions, which lead to contaminated karma, and this leads to all the suffering experiences that beings experience continuously. Beings, whether in the realms where suffering is most apparent, most manifest, and that is, or of the greatest strength, and that is in the three lower realms of the hells and spirit realms and animal realms, or whether one is born in the so-called happier migrations of humans or gods.
아디네 자당한테 동아 삼다야 될 동아유 동아된 규유 동아스 캬바주지 동아스 당한저기 아주기 류기 레다 녀모 옹유 주에 아주 풍부들라 안에 캬바주지 동아라 그래서 제산디 동아유 동아야 그냥 텔라테네 용거래 규유 동아디 그냥 텔라테네 용거래 제산 당한 가서 가유 동아 나유 동아 치유 동아 세야다 되네 양 차상 당한저기 레다 녀모지 풍부 뒤여 발에 되네 안 텔라테네 용거래 제산 제산 당한저기 아주 풍부디 다 동아이랑 신리에서 근데 도시나네 섬땅고래서 될 아주 풍부디 동아이랑 신리에 섬땅와는 되니 공바이나 언델라 다 가서 뒤 캬바두지 동아 섬땅다 두 섬땅고래서 이제 그생 되네 지시로다.
Furthermore, when we started this presentation, I presented the one way that suffering can be divided, and that is into the threefold suffering, threefold presentation of suffering, which is firstly the suffering of physical and mental pain, secondly the suffering of transient happiness, and the third, all-pervasive suffering. And last week, when we came to the end of a different division of suffering, that of where suffering is divided into 8, we saw how the eighth of this eightfold division is the suffering of having the 5 contaminated aggregates. And these 5 contaminated aggregates are an illustration of the third type of suffering in the threefold division, that of all-pervasive suffering. So therefore these two are the same. And what this means is that it's due to our contaminated karma that we have accumulated under the power of our own afflicted minds that we keep taking uncontrolled rebirth in samsara, and we keep having these aggregates, physical and mental aggregates, which are in the very nature of suffering. They are in the nature of suffering because they were accumulated or they were attained due to afflictions, our own destructive emotions. Moreover, these contaminated aggregates are an illustration of the third type of suffering, this all-pervasive suffering, and they are the very basis upon which the first two types of suffering, as well as all the other ways of dividing suffering, are experienced. In other words, it's because we have contaminated physical and mental aggregates that we can experience the suffering of physical and mental pain. We can experience the suffering of transient happiness, and so forth.
다 가니스티네 용고래 다 제사 디 풍보 매와 쇠발라 아니 가니스 매와 쇠다데 하고 그러다 매와 쇠다 가니스 하고 그래라나 다당보 안디 용하데 가니스 가와니 기고 가니스 용고래 세디 바 심주 지에도 난 유단기 매발라 기와 말에 제사 당한주기 뒤지기 최 근데 지나 유단 낀질래 되니 기고래 제사 되는자 당한주 풍보디 아니 유단 낀라 되니 기와래 제사 유단 낀데 가르에서 한주 심주 지에도 다들 레다 녀모 바세디 되니 기고래 제사다 Gewang Amagi, Gewang Amang, the Pumbo Kiagi, and Lesaje, and Lesa Lady Gitibures. She's a lady young, and a new mobile, Ginjin, a lady Sagore. She's not a leda new mobile at the Kiawares. She's not a Pumbo di, Gudi, leda new mobile set Kiares, and this Gudi Dires or down.
These contaminated physical and mental aggregates that we have, they have been achieved independent on causes and conditions. This is important to acknowledge because if something has been attained due to causes and conditions, it means through eliminating those causes, the result will not be achieved. So all impermanent phenomena, or to express it differently, all compounded phenomena, they come about independence on causes. They are produced independence on causes. And because they are produced independence on causes, if those causes are eradicated completely, because those causes don't exist, there can be no result from them. And that immediately makes us think, these contaminated aggregates, being impermanent, being compounded phenomena, therefore come from causes and conditions, and if those causes and conditions can be eliminated, this will mean I no longer have to experience the suffering that comes about in dependence on having these contaminated aggregates. So how do I eliminate those causes and conditions? So the first part to answer that question, how to eliminate the causes that lead to these contaminated aggregates, is to identify the cause. And the cause, as has been mentioned previously, is the contaminated karma that has been accumulated by our own afflicted minds. To express that differently, the result that are these contaminated physical and mental aggregates come about in dependence on a cause. That cause is contaminated karma. Contaminated karma, whilst being the cause of the contaminated aggregates, the contaminated karma itself is a result. A result of what? Afflicted minds. Our destructive emotions, our afflictions, lead to the accumulation of contaminated karma, which in turn lead to contaminated aggregates. So here we see that the afflicted minds are a cause of our contaminated karma that lead to these contaminated aggregates, and therefore it's these that we must eliminate.
마야기 탑람디 가르쳐고래 람나 당한 저기 다 마음바나 풍벌기에 유디래다 녀모벌 차고 지단 레다 녀모바데 한도 방고 그래지 대디 아저 녀마 아저 레사바는 레디 파메바 소야다 다 레사바 사마 주바지 나 아저기 레사바 사마 주바지 가 레사 사바 사야라 파가고 그래서 지단 레사바 사야게 기인도 수지거서 녀모바데 치고 지단 아저기를 녀모바데 방고 그래서 지단 레다 녀모바데 방고 그래 지단 레다 녀모바데 아저기 방바이나 안 마오바나 안 레다 녀모바 디왕기 디나싱아 저 풍보디 레다 녀모왕기 풍보디 깨발렘베 풍보디 용 말해야지 이 마요바이나 근데 동아기 대신 예를 셔바는 동아디게 차사 용 말해서 동아다 유외 동아 캬바주 동아세게 디 용 말해야지 지사디 동아미야 소야라다 레다 녀모바도 방고 그래야지
So the aggregates that we have right now in this life, these aggregates, these contaminated physical mental aggregates, have been are a result that has come about in dependence on our previously accumulated contaminated karma. So that previously accumulated contaminated karma has ripened into these aggregates. So that cause has ripened into a result, into a fruit, and that is our contaminated aggregates. So we are now living with this basis of suffering and thereby experiencing suffering. So these aggregates have been achieved, that cause has ripened. So we can't eliminate these aggregates that we have right now, they're a result. But what we can do is within our hands lies our future aggregates, so to speak. And that is because our future aggregates are still to be achieved. Our future physical and mental aggregates are still to be experienced. So our future aggregates will, as things are at the moment, they too will be come about in dependence on the ripening of contaminated karma that has been accumulated by motivated by afflicted minds, accumulated by afflicted minds. So this is the process that it goes from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime for all of us. This is the process that we need to break. And we can break this process. We can destroy this wheel, because this is the wheel of cyclic existence. What we need to do is stop accumulating contaminated karma. How to do so? The mere wish on its own won't do it. We have to eliminate the cause that leads to the accumulation of contaminated karma, and that's the afflicted mind. So you remember there's this stream of continuity. We have a result, which is our contaminated aggregates. This result came from a cause, which is contaminated karma. Contaminated karma itself, though, is a result coming from a cause of the afflicted minds. So by eliminating those afflicted minds, will no longer accumulate contaminated karma, and therefore we will no longer have contaminated aggregates in future lives. Or contaminated aggregates can also be called suffering aggregates, because they are the basis of suffering. They're pervaded by suffering, the basis for all physical and mental suffering, the basis for the suffering of transient happiness. This is the wheel we can break, and we can break by eliminating our afflicted minds.
안에는 자당한 저기 내가 녀모바디 안에 방야리아 안에 탑람 가르치고래 랍나 당보가 저기 능아 예수님 예죄된비 주름 써야 되래. 레사바 마사야게 된다라 안에 주름 써야 돼. 되네 안에 레냐마 사샤바 예나 능아 저기 님보도 쉬고네 안에 샤야 돼. 샤바셔야 돼. 샤바진 안에 레데 매워서가 된 차고래.
So how then to stop this accumulation of contaminated karma? The first step, crucial step, is to cultivate ethical restraint. Because the mind that is being ethical ensures that we do not accumulate further contaminated karma. So this is the first step. The second, to ensure that to do something about the past negative karma that we have already accumulated, we need to purify through the 4 opponent powers. So here then the first step is cultivating ethical restraint, and secondly, to engage in purification practice through relying on the 4 opponent powers.
sabon ye na ya kin chu da lu da sa da de ne gi zhe me ba na sabon ye ba zam ni gu ji ge ma ra sabon ga ze lo ga ze sha na nyu jie ya ma le o di na xi a zu ge nga song la dang ya wa da nga so da de ne ko wa jie ge le ji yue de ba yin na ya a zu ge ji nyu mo ba de bang ba yin na me ba sui sha ba yin na le de yue ba na ya ko wa le ji tu go ma le yin za a zu ge da di na ne nyu mo ba me ba sui de ji chi xue de nyu mo me ba sui de cha go le.
We need to reduce our vast store of negative karma that we have previously accumulated and bring a stop to further accumulation of negative karma through those 2 key steps of ethical restraint and relying on the 4 opponent powers. For a variety of reasons, including that it gives us the space, the mental capacity to focus on what's really important, and that's eliminating the afflicted minds. Eliminating the afflicted minds is more important than eliminating negative karma, because once we've eliminated our afflicted minds, whatever negative karma that we have, whatever karma that we have not purified, will not be able to ripen. And this is because it's independent on afflictions that previously accumulated karma can ripen. Can be likened to a seed, for example. A seed cannot sprout into a plant unless it has a variety of conditions. It needs soil, it needs warmth, it needs moisture, and so forth. Lacking those conditions, a seed cannot ripen. So therefore, whilst we do need to purify previously accumulated negative karma and bring an end to the accumulation of further negative karma, we have to eliminate our afflicted minds.
잠재 공비고 공로데 자원이 매가 수투구를 베스나 수투야 두고 말해. 아주 내가 맞게야 지당은 내가 맞게야 가지고 녀모바 내가 맞게야 가야 돼. 아주 류가 있으면 예제되면 주름 써야 돼. 근데 주름 써와 있나? 아니 녀모바 내가 깨야지 가야지 류가 있으면 예제되면 주름 써야 돼. 아니 뒤에 맞아 안에 아주 잠재 공부에 샬리아 공로 내가 기투 말해. 공로 기 말해. 안디 나심 당한 저기 유라 차과께바나 차과티 님보텔에 내가 변은 유들에 미비 미두보 거미하다 안에 미다보 거미하다 안도 삼다베나 안에 유들에 미비 차과께야다 도스네 내가 가줘야 돼 가야 돼 도삼당 당고로와.
Amongst our afflicted minds, there's really a wide variety. We know of anger, we know of attachment, there's pride, there's jealousy, spite, so many different kinds of afflictions. So we approach this in the elimination, the destruction of our afflictions in a couple of ways. Firstly, we need to rely on the temporary antidotes. The antidotes that do not completely eradicate the afflictions, but do temporarily overcome them, overpower them. So these are crucial for us. Whilst we are striving to eliminate the afflictions in their entirety, in order to have the mental space to progress in our training, to ensure we don't accumulate further non-virtue, we need to also rely on the temporary antidotes. So we need to do both together. So temporary antidotes then include primarily ethical restraint, where we restrain our way of thinking, ensuring our way of thinking doesn't come on our minds. We don't come under the influence of the afflictions. This is primary. And thereby, we don't accumulate negative mental karma, nor does our physical and verbal actions be motivated by the afflictions, and thereby we restrain our physical behavior and our verbal behavior by restraining our minds. This is ethics, restraining our minds. That's first and primary. Secondly, there are specific antidotes to specific afflictions, such as love is the antidote to anger. When love is present, we can't get angry. Or when you notice attachment for an object arising, to overcome the exaggeration of the pleasant characteristics or the desirable characteristics of the object, we need to make the object appear more realistic to us. Overcome this exaggeration by reminding ourselves of the unpleasant attributes of the object.
Dele traduce some kigoro. Chesa denigi dunga some dele chabo bangora ngazu luida and sedigi and ngazu chawalia chabo bangore chapa de kagor kasne tani ngazu chakwa jede di yawodo di jewo some chakwa jingoro dele gyuen ro tong gyuen hona dele deba bogo ma deba mabna chakwa de kagor chesa ngazu sedigi gyuen ro samda de and chiwe dunga nawe dunga and denigi and do some gyuen some de sedela chakbegi chakwadigi ne kagore 제산 chakwa 방탕디 가진 안저기 콜둥아 삼당하디게 해야돼 런달디기 네 anga 체디기 아니 콜위 자와 유다 콜위 자와라 chakwa기에게 맞게 된다 송고 제산디 삼다베나 아주 콜위 체디기 아니 콜위 유치리아 chakwa 번거래 제래.
Over these last couple of months, we've looked at this presentation on the Eightfold Suffering. And so these include the suffering of birth, aging, sickness, and death, the suffering of meeting the unwanted, the suffering of being separated from the wanted, and the suffering of not getting what one wants despite striving for it. So when we were looking at this, we saw how to overcome our various types of suffering, and a general way was to recognize the role that attachment plays. We are beings in the desire realm. Attachment arises readily for us. And attachment is this wish for something, this longing for something. And this may be a longing to achieve something, or a longing to not meet something, to be separated from something, but there's this desire, there's this longing. If we can transform our way of thinking so that we no longer have this desire, this longing, this yearning to achieve something or to be separated from something, we won't have any attachment. Because it's longing for something that is attachment. And for us as ordinary samsaric beings, what we desire are the delights, the pleasures of samsara. And these can be expressed through worldly objects, but also through our mental wishes, for our hopes to be fulfilled. So this wide variety of samsaric delights and pleasures, these we need to identify what it is that we long for, not just in the material world, but also through our thoughts. Separate ourselves from these desires, overcome these desires. And as long as we then, or to the extent that we no longer long and desire, our attachment will be reduced.
아디니 자당한 주 녀몽바 방에 나네 조다 녀몽바 뒤에 차상 조다 가화진 리거래 센다가 주게 다시 마릭바세 딜레티네 리거래 진짜 녀몽바 뒤에 차기야래 콩도기야 나제기야 아니 젠려 치sup지야 아니 차상 녀몽바 가네시네 차상 자위 규디 가르친 리거스네 나세방아 라신 주바지면아 다도 주버지면 다선세 될레든 이거 레지래 세상다 녀mom바 저위 규용서 뒤래 세상가서 녀mom바 자와니 매바 수행 방발라 다선 마리바디 방고고래 세상가다 코발게 규조디 다선 마리바디 디지나네 되차게 근데 되차게 왕게 아니 가지게 아니 레양아 바사네 아니 나선게 레사고래 세상디 한 다선 마리바게 다선 마리바디 기인제네 콩로 디왕게 아니 지게 양 나서게 레양아 바사 세상가서 녀모모 레사야디 당보 녀모바 치고 그래 진짜 녀모바 자게 자와디 다선 마리바셔야 돼 세상가서다 방야 조어디 가르방 것은 다시 말이 바디 방바 있나 아니 되샤당 콩로당 가제 콩랑슈기 호 매바 차로 세상에서 자유기 유 용서 녀모버게 유조디다 다시 말이 바세들이스 세상다 다시 말이 바디 가지고 디 방고 그래 정한다
All our afflictions, whether anger or attachment or pride or jealousy, all of them, these afflictions have one shared root cause, and that is ignorance, in particular, the ignorance of self-grasping. This is a mind of ignorance that grasps at the self as existing in the way that it appears, as existing from its own side, as existing by its own defining characteristics. This ignorance grasps at the self or believes that the self exists in this way when it does not. And it's from this ignorance that all the other afflictions come. And from this plethora of afflictions that follow from ignorance, we accumulate our contaminated karma. When that contaminated karma ripens, it ripens in uncontrolled rebirth within the realms of samsara. It ripens in the continued attainment of these suffering aggregates, and thereby our continued suffering. So this stream of continuity starts with the ignorance of self-grasping. If we eliminate this ignorance of self-grasping, this mind of ignorance, this ignorance consciousness, which grasps at the self as existing truly or inherently by way of its own nature, if we eliminate that, the root cause of all the afflictions will be eradicated, and therefore we won't have any afflictions ripening. We therefore won't accumulate any contaminated karma, and therefore we will no longer take uncontrolled rebirth. We will no longer have to live with these suffering aggregates, the basis of all our suffering. So therefore, it's the ignorance of self-grasping that we need to strive to eradicate.
방구고래 제 방발라 안에 가니스 방구고래 세대다 간저 방나로 가니스 방고래래도 다 가사 다생 인연보디 가르라자 다음에 또 비셔럽세들이지 진짜 다음에 또 비셔럽 주 곰제 곰나 안에 곰제 안에 방마도 셴 방투예요 말에 진짜 다음에 또 비셔럽 주 공고고래 진짜 다음에 또 비셔럽 곰제네 안에 디 곰발에 때네 다시 말이 방투고래 진짜 디네자 다음에 또 비셔럽 공고고래지래.
As we heard earlier, the various afflictions have their own antidotes to temporarily overcome them. The ignorance of self-grasping, it too has an antidote, and that is the wisdom realizing selflessness. And this antidote can completely eradicate ignorance, this ignorance of self-grasping. So there's one antidote and one antidote only to the ignorance of self-grasping, and that is wisdom. In particular, the wisdom realizing selflessness or the wisdom realizing emptiness.
당하서 다음에 또 배셔로 공부하라 다음에 또 고고로 받아. 다음에 또 고바 인자. 다음에 또 거나 다음에 가서 또 고래스. 당하서 이게 다음에 또 해기 탑람들까지 비지 땅고래 센당 저기 남에게 don달아야 제베체할 삼땅고 그래.
Therefore, if it is the wisdom realizing selflessness, and this wisdom alone that eradicates the root cause of all suffering, the ignorance of self-grasping, then how does one cultivate this wisdom that realizes selflessness? One has to, of course, then realize selflessness. So this is then something that one needs to understand well.
남의 또 봐라 내가 주게 당보 코로나야 내가 저 간에 삼당고리란다 내가 주게 다 세대가 주기디나 내가 저가 세들리고랑 삼나는 용거와 제가 당보 코로나 나 세디 미다바로 삼당고리 미다바 삼다 가지 다나 세디 규다 建想了규다建了对那几个吧그 규와 기지 규와 주고요 바디 한거 도스전에 저기 도삼당 고거와
To realize selflessness, we need to see very clearly how the self appears to us. But actually the starting point in this meditation is to reflect on impermanence. So impermanent, phenomena that are impermanent, when we hear this term, we should think of two key components to impermanence. Whatever is impermanent, firstly, arises in dependence on causes and conditions. Whatever is impermanent arises in dependence on causes and conditions. Secondly, whatever is impermanent changes momentarily. Whatever is impermanent changes momentarily. These are the two key components that should arise in our mind whenever we hear the term impermanence.
안 아말레티네 깨와래세. 진짜 아말레티네 깨와 잠게 아는가 야 체체 자기를 봤어. 디 잠게야 저거 막 될라야 하는 저기 디 체체 차이게 살롱 체이게 튕긴 칼라다 세다 주다 되게 초바 되게 비주 땅와 디술레 띠네도 지내야 살롱지야 체체 주고래서. 두 체체는 거다 그디네 깨체여질라 깨네 아말레티네 깨와래 살롱제 대한 유ኛ서 사야동야 세레티네 살롱지야 체체 주고래. 지난 저다 깨와나신 당보 깨어도 다가랑 진 되고면 지가서는 야 체체 유어루도 와 지난 거 당보 나신지 아미 깨어도 당보 간지에네 다가랑 진 되고 말했어 지난 거 칼라다 세다 아미고 오메기 뉴발티네 야 체체 유어루고 와 유어루도 와 지난 하세디 당보 유 아말레티네 깨데네 세다 롱 데스우데 야 유어 체체 유어루고 지난 당보 So
if we take ourselves, of course we're all born from a mother in this life. So we can say, yes, I came about independent on my mother. So what was the cause? Because we heard everything that's impermanent changes momentarily and comes about independence on causes and conditions. What's the cause of ourselves? Oh, we came from our mothers. The cause is our mother. But we need to go a little deeper than that, because we didn't only come about independence on our mother, because we grew and aged and we are where we are now. And that was independence on a number of other causes and conditions. We were nurtured first by our mother's milk and then by food and many other conditions so that we could grow up.
rakwa 장도 교어 주고 받은 세부를 차고도 거로 지나 당보 거서 rakwa 되는 삼다 다 차고 지나 당나 세디 다 아말에 때네 깨요 끼우도 되는 끼는 교어 주고도 지나 깨와다가 나지 되레면도 교어 주고도 왔으면 삼다 되네라는 두시는 삼다에서 제일 당아 세다나 나 세디 다 간에시 라구도 세빙 하세다 거 간에시 라구도 세네 당아 줄로려야 나요도 나세데 간에시 난거래 제가 나디 가르에서 당아 나 세데 간에시 뭐 숨고래 산주기다 지리 다당보 nga 세디 나도 뭐 숨고 거다 nga 세디 간지 뭐 숨고 그래서 다번 다디 제시다나 지고 그래.
Well, that illustration, it's clear. We all understand that. But we need to go a lot more deeply. So a key point here is to come to recognize how the self appears to us, or our sense of self, or our self-identity, how this appears to our mind. What is this sense of self that appears to our mind? So this is a crucial point to recognize, to gain a clear understanding of what our sense of self is, what it is that appears to us as our self-identity, that appears to our mind as our self-identity.
nga amale kebare nga ane devotu seada nga ane ya jige digi ko nga ane jige sanjo ko mo thogore se chinga zo nga ji yoro wada nga ji yoro wada chesa yoba enza da nga de gawa du sine nga zo ganis ta du sine ganichil nga zo nga se de ganichil ngo sungu ore sine nga du samda wenda nga zo nga dugu labyo de nga zo gawa ngo sungu sine ngazo 강반이 되고 공부 접제 나다 모던 가지는 ngazo 수부디 파 샹다 질이야 찍네 찍을 보여 줘도 갑라 nga 두고에 레고 당 수부디 두고 수부디 구겨 당조 지나 nga 저기 수부디 구겨 당조 다가랑라 nga 두고에서 nga디 가와 삼던 것은 수기 풍보들라 따비게 따네 되는 바 자와 지힌 찍라 nga 세지 뭐 송고 당 가지고 뭐 소야라.
We talk about ourselves, we think about ourselves. So there is this self that we refer to. If we were asked, we would all affirm, yes, I was born from my mother. And if we ask, how are you? You may say, oh, I'm quite good. Oh, I'm a bit tired today. I am quite good. I'm a bit tired. And as we often say in Buddhism, we all want happiness. I want happiness. So there's always this reference to an I, to a self. Where is this? For example, if we are traveling from A to B, whether we are walking or driving, or in the past when we could fly, we would be moving from one place to another. So I am going, I am walking, I am traveling by car. So we're imputing here, imputing by mind, the sense of self onto the physical aggregate, onto the body. We're imputing I onto the body that is in the process of moving, of walking or driving a car. So the sense of self here is imputed by mind onto the physical aggregate.
nga de yesde kabla nga di kanishil ngo sungor sene nga zu phungbo subu di gugyo ma da che anji galya an phazo ma ro che ani ji ji du chen zu de be kabla ani de ni ge du de phungbo de pha da che nga de ye nga de la byo de nga de ga wa da go phungbo de pha da che ne nga se de phungbo di 구교 마다지 두 뒤에 벽갑기 된 찍라 나 세대 하다는 제고 따고 그러다 진짜 아주 딜레 로소 가지 돼요 말다 풍보들 로소 가지 자요 말에 진짜 풍보 그런 구교 마다지 요거 파서 마도 다가라 니 찍리야 대비 링딜라 된 풍보들라 나 대대 세대 풍보들라 다셔 따배 따고 그래 수기 공부하다가 되게 수기 공부하면
And similarly, I imagine now when you're watching on your computer or on your phone, you're not traveling, but you're sitting. So, where's the sense of self? You're not walking anywhere, you're now sitting somewhere. And again, your mind is imputing a sense of self onto your physical aggregate. You're not imputing the sense of self anywhere other than on your aggregate. Not imputing it on somewhere else outside. The sense of self is only imputed onto the aggregates, nowhere else.
나 가브리엘라 저기 초월이야 아니 그 대나라 아주 초월 대나라 끼어도 나 기부도 올라고라 다디 갑라 아는 강주가 세대 가월 때고서는 강주 초월 대화들이야 초월 대화들이야 삼다체 엉아 기부도 올라고 저디 갑라 나 세대 가월 때고서는 강주 초월 대화를 봤다 다다 때고와
So there, in those illustrations, we saw how the mind imputes the sense of self onto the physical aggregate. But then other times, when, say, someone says, "How are you?" and you say, "Oh, I'm really in a good mood today. I am feeling happy." So here, I am happy. Our mind is imputing the sense of self onto this pleasant feeling. So feeling is a consciousness, and this pleasant feeling, onto that, another mind is imputing our sense of self. So this is just like before. The self previously was imputed onto the physical aggregate, and here it's imputed onto the feeling aggregate.
nga yore nga debudu nga duguye nga diguye sene chi nga sede ngoni nga meba mare nga de ngoni yoro wada nga chi nga yore yoba inza ana nga yoba inza ana gade nga de gane ngoi sungu yoro sene phumbo nga bo gano chi le pha ta je nga ta bigi ta ne jawa chi kin jiwu chi la ana nga se le go da jawa be ne su yu phumbo de pha su yogo chi rodu kabla su yu phumbo chi ne chi pha rodu kabla yogo chi rowi gi 풍보 딜라 따네 수기 풍보 딜라 따네 요구게 자와진 저긴 자와지긴 끼부딜라 나스 디갑스 나스 끼부딜라 나스 딩원스 거 내가 아주 초와 대화 중요하다 초와 대화 중요한지 초와디 대화 중간도 규르시 초와 대화 딜라 따지는 아주 가 대부도 세야디 데니기 초와 용행기 아니 롱주행기 나 끼부질라 아니 디갑스다 나스다고 제가 아주 나스야디 아주 두 삼다와 나스야디 타직도 디 풍보들이 가래라요 말에 초와대 가래라요 말다 풍보가보 가로질레 파다네 까브레르 풍보 수기 풍보라다고 까브레 소위 풍보라다고 데니기 풍보가보 가로를 찔라 따네 파르 파다제 데니기 자와지행기 자와지행 기부질라 기부세 데니기 자와지행 찔다 나 세딩 아주 나 세딩이지다 그래서 나 세다 나 상계 오래 제가 대호정아 지질래가 제거를 나 지고를 세다 나 세디 데니지 요르다 오늘 우인이 술을 나디 데니지 되려
So what I've been presenting here is how the I exists in reality. So when we say, I am sitting here, then our one consciousness or mind is imputing the sense of I, the sense of self, onto our physical aggregate. If I ask you, how are you today? And you say, I'm fine, I'm having a good day. This is the same. Here, a mind is imputing your sense of self onto the consciousness of feeling, of a pleasant feeling, and onto this pleasant consciousness that is a pleasant feeling, I is imputed by mind. And when we set our motivation, and we set the motivation that I want to attain Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings, here mind is imputing this sense of self onto a physical aggregate, a mental aggregate, or collection of them. So this is how the I exists in reality, as a mere imputation by mind onto any of the aggregates.
tu la yo de nga zu le lo le nga se nga zu lo le cha du ka bla ka ne cha go du lo de la ka ne cha go du sim ju she ba ina ane ka ne nan go re se nga zu lo le ka ne nan go re se nga se di nga zu phung bo la ma den bo ko rong lo su ye de ken ko rong nga zu phung bo di le lo su 유해되긴 아니 지금 여봐지라 유어균에 줘야 메테고 그런 다랑 유어균 줘야 메 강라야 맞된 바지 그런 원에 그런 원에 유해되 바지 능고 당아도 능고 나야라 대신 강원에 원에 수도 간에 제스는 맞아 풍봉하고 강로지를 파 바지 따네 요구 자와지 행기 나디 풍봉아 따샤바지 마도 매바지 따샤바지 당아 저 나시 삼도 땅에도 아주 로려야 간에 시차고 능고를 랍나 나디 아주 풍보디에 많이 봐 풍보디를 로소 코롱편이 유해디바 직제 오늘 유해디바 디안에 요균에 줘야 메테가 강라이 마템바 코롱원이 줍도 여바시 능고를 당아서 로려야 되는 능고를 해제
So that is how the I, or the sense of self, exists in reality. But now let's move on to how the I actually appears to our mind, though. When we think of ourselves that we are traveling, we are sitting, how we are feeling, how that sense of self appears to us is quite different. The way our sense of self appears to us, or our I appears, is as if it's separate from our aggregates. It appears to have two characteristics. One, that is unchanging, and secondly, that is independent. It's not influenced by anything at all. It's separate from the aggregates. It's independent. This is how the I actually appears to us. It appears to be firstly unchanging and independent. But as we've just looked at, as we've just seen, this is not how the I exists in reality. The I actually is imputed by mind onto the aggregates, whereas it appears to us as being unchanging and independent of the aggregates.
rak바로 하고도 마도 아주 참못 하고 말와 저 소삼단도 쓰는 세디 가르레스는 세디 남사 풍보딜에 많이 보고는 직디와 직여디 해직 다 다른 거에 메팅 디와 인디와 여디 여러분이 삼나래 내용도 지선 되게 차고로 봐 지선 나줄야 나세디 롤야 낭수 대단 롤라 나야디 가르치는 거였네 풍보딜 아마도 그런 랑그 그런 로소 그런 원에 줍디게 난거래 난거래 원에서 나데 원에데 가르레스는 풍부대진이를 셰바나신 풍봉하고 강루질 파 다전에 파 다샤바지마도 매바래 매반장 마술은 낭수당 원에가 원에 수디당 아주 낭수이디 미든바 차들다 미든바래 제가 나네 미든바 세디시고 제가 마술은 가서 롤레 나요도 가르치던 거서 그런 원에 줍디 풍보를 맞도 그런 원에 줍디게 진난 거. 그래서 딘낭수 대다 강원의 여sun이디 튕고 말. 그래서 강원의 여바도 풍봉하고 가는 때네 여디 맞도 강라 맞도 바지 얘기님도 왔다가 저기 되지. 마 조구요 랍디디 풍보디 많이 바제 나디 조구요바 통도. 그래서 수부디 구교 땅지 파디 조디 마 조구요 세다. 젠다 미지네 코 수부 구교 다 조디 코 조구도 슬래고 마도 부 수부디 로소 나지 라고 말 왔다. 수부디를 다시 다가나 조구인자 나 조구도 코 조구 세팅 가서 수부디를 다시 하는 마도 예민도. 디나심 진짜 우인이 수디 나디 풍봉하고 가르칠 파 따벌려 파 따바 잠기 이래. 제가 당한서 로려 나에도 나지 나에도 강라에 마도 그런 로소 예보 홍보들 로소 예보 홍보를 맞된 거 그런 로소 예보 그런 거 줍대 봐 있는 거. 제가 나서 나와 나신데 우인이 수디 튕고 말다. 제가 미팅 바래. 나네 미팅 바래.
So I hope from what's being said here that it's very apparent that there's a disconnect between how the I actually exists and how it spontaneously appears to us, without thinking about it, how the I appears to us. There is a disconnect. These are not in accordance. They are not in harmony. Because as what we heard previously, our sense of self is imputed onto the aggregates. It's imputed onto the physical aggregates or the mental aggregates. But it appears to our mind as if it's been unchanging, as if it's not related to the aggregates. almost as if it's separate from the aggregates, just here, observing the aggregates, but independent of the aggregates. So this is how it appears, how the sense of self appears, as if it's not related to the aggregates, it is independent from the aggregates, and moreover, that it's unchanging. But when you think about it just a little bit, we know it cannot exist in this way. Because if we say, I am sitting here, we're imputing that onto what? This body. If someone else says, if we say to someone, where am I? They say, you're over there. How do they express that? They're imputing a sense of I onto our body, onto our physical aggregate. So it's clear. Mind imputes self onto the aggregates, whether physical or mental. But yet, that is not how it appears to us. The way it appears is different from that. It appears as if it's independent of the aggregates and unchanging. So there's this disconnect, a discordance between how the I exists in reality and the way we relate to the I.
다가나 요래 섬 짐비기 짐바 친구를 당한도 짐발 한기에 당한주기 나주기 하고 두고 말 당한주기를 되는 짐바 지어다 내 짐바디 나주랑 디지로래 나주 나디 풍보당 가라야 마도 랑원이 줍되게 나와 나신지 파 요래 섬 다가나 요래 섬 짐비 짐바디 다신 말이 봐서 디시고다 디 짐발 한기 다신 말이 봐서 제사디 뇽몽바께 규차상 디레다 디 다신 말이 봐서 디시 되는 디징을로 될라 다시 말이 바하려고 그래. 지상 아주 뇽몽바께 차상 될래 되는 거다.
This way then that the self appears to our mind as being independent and unchanging is innate. It's not something we need to construct. It just naturally the self appears to us as being independent of the aggregates, is not influenced by anything at all, and unchanging. So those two characteristics. This innately appears to us. It's not something that we need to construct. And then, immediately, a consciousness grasps at the self as existing in the way that it appears, independent and unchanging. This consciousness is not in accordance with reality, because we've heard how the self exists in reality is as a mere imputation by mind. But this consciousness that believes that the self exists differently from that it exists independent of the aggregates and in an unchanging manner, this consciousness is not in accordance with reality and therefore is an ignorance. It's ignorance. And this consciousness that is an ignorance grasps that or believes that the self exists in a way that it does not. And this ignorance is the root cause of all suffering. From this ignorance come all our afflicted minds and the resulting suffering.
Adi da dasin marikpase. Jizan di dasin marikpase di karit singorasene nga sa di kanglai madu korong ngoni jubde yobaji singoreda di dasin marikpache. Jisa ta nga jugi di meba suya da meba to gure la gurwada. Jizan da meba di karire labne. Jizan nga sa di kanglai phungpo na cheche 강라에 맞도 그런 거는 주바디 자오기는 민도 선배 매발도 그래 자오기는 매발 근데 귀다 차셔 강라에 맞도 그런 거는 줍데 동바디 동부에 동바디를 동이라고 그래 지산 다음에 발라 그래 니도 그래 지산 니도 바이나 니니 또 별로니디다 미딘 바로 와다 가르세는 대시 다스 마리바디 가는 줄 하디 강라에 뭐 풍풍아 뭐 강라에 맞도 그런 거는 줍데 진디고 와 다음에 바디고 디기 풍부스 나세데 강라야 마도랑 오늘 두바 싸우기니 민두 섬거로와 진짜 니녀로니디 거기 진단 가와래 뭐 진단 원가 차지 그래 진짜 니네기 다음에 또 비글로디 풍부세야디 강사세야디 풍부 강라야 마도랑 오늘 두바 싸우기니 민두 섬별로디 나주길래 끼고 그러다 니 나주길래 요마다다 진짜 디께네 딜로디 아 슉처 공과 제 슉처처 공부여도 누버처처 당해도 다신디 누버 충충충 루고 그러다
The root cause then, as we heard earlier, is the ignorance of self-grasping, the root cause of all suffering. So this consciousness that is an ignorance because it believes that something exists when it does not. It's an ignorance it is ignorance because it is not, it's a consciousness that is not in accordance with reality. It's an ignorance that believes or grasps at a self as existing in a way that it does not. This innate ignorance of self-grasping believes the self to be independent and unchanging when it's not, when the self is rather merely imputed by mind onto the aggregates. But the ignorance doesn't know this, hence ignorance. Rather, it believes the self is independent and unchanging. So this, as we've just heard, is discordant with reality. To eliminate this ignorance, we need to apply the antidote, which is in accordance with reality. The antidote to ignorance is wisdom. And it's the wisdom realizing selflessness, which means it's a wisdom that realizes that the self does not exist independently and unchangingly. Therefore, it's wisdom. It's in accordance with reality. So the way the self appears to us, the innate way it appears, is not in accordance with how it exists. When our wisdom realizes that it's empty of existing in the way that it appears, to express it differently, when our wisdom realizes that the self is empty of being independent, is empty of being unchanging, then we develop the wisdom realizing selflessness, or the wisdom realizing emptiness. And these two minds, ignorance and wisdom, or in particular, the ignorance of self-grasping and the wisdom realizing selflessness, these two minds are contrary. They have a different way of, a different mode of apprehension, a different way of apprehending the self. One, the ignorance, is not in accordance with reality, hence it's an ignorance. It believes the self to exist in a way that it does not. The other is wisdom, because it realizes how the self exists in accordance with reality. And as we develop this wisdom to that extent, we start to weaken this innate ignorance. And to the extent that we develop the wisdom, to that extent we weaken this innate ignorance. And to the extent that we weaken this innate ignorance, the resulting afflictive minds are weaker and less powerful.
nangudu sebe da di cheba che war dang ba lo la kanis nangudu sebe che sang lo la nang na de dang ba ha ko che sang lo la nang lo ga nang so gang la ya ma de ba gang la ya ma rang mo ne ju ba nang go ro ba che sang di na wa na xin di da lo la na wa na xin di da nga de ga wa du sa di dang lo ge cheba che wo zai wo ho da da de xi pung bo da gang la ya ma ko rong mo ne ju de lo le nga nangudu wa di na wa na xin nga de da ga wa du sa di ga re se ne nga a me ke wa re che sang di 아메키 연도네 충충이 맞아요. 다 되는 마다 가지 두수 쳇쳇 차버려. 제가도 로리아 나한테 가지 나한테 강래 맞아 봐. 강래 맞 풍보다 규진 강래 맞 그런 원이 줍도 năng 와. 제가 나세디 당보 하나 아말레티네 기도 아말레티네 기 되네야 쳇쳇 세다 세다 되네래 되네. 아니 야 쳇쳇 두두도 이거 두도 왔어. 제가 로들 나와 나신지 가지 민도 와서 비게 되네게 거 제가 라고 당보 거 두수에 뒤서라. 난 이바들에 가서 이바들에 가서 가서 삼당 와서 대시 쉐바나 이제 제가 하셔야 돼. 나 두도 셔야다. 나 대대여 셔야 돼. 나도 두스테디 풍볼 파 요구 제제 조디 갑라 nga 조구도 마도 조구도 라고 마도 풍볼 아마 되봐 강라 아마 되봐 nga디 조구도 쓰는 아주 기신이 통해 제민도 조해서 민도와 세상 nga 조구도 풍보디 파 요구 제제 조디 갑라 nga 조구도 라기도 와서 제자디 땡로를 나와나 신지 데니 강라 아마 되봐 지디 예사 말에서 비기 다 제주도 섬도 rakwa 섬당 거로 가지고 딘딘디기 남샤 딘이 다땡아서 다음에 보도에 김진망고제 딘지게 남자 섬다 딘제세디 딜에 뛰기도와 디뛰기도와 디니 뛰기도와 섬비 뛰비 남자 섬다에도 딘지게 남자 섬다 진짜 다음에 보도 비기 또에게 탑람디 다 딘지게 남자 섬다지 제가 제시 또 가자고
So here we strive to develop wisdom that realizes selflessness because to the extent that we become familiar with wisdom and the strength that arises within us, to that extent our self-grasping weakens, and therefore their resulting afflictions become less powerful, less destructive. So how then to develop this wisdom that is of such great use in that it eases our suffering both now and leads us to being eventually able to eradicate suffering in its entirety? There's only one method to develop the wisdom that realizes emptiness. Only one. And that is using analysis, using investigation. So how then does this investigation proceed? Well, there are a few steps in this meditation. The first step, crucial first step, is to get to see clearly for oneself how our sense of self-identity appears to our mind. How does the self appear to us? So we've heard that it appears in a way that is independent and unchanging. So that's the theory. We hear this. We've heard this now. We know this now. We can remember this. But we need to see it for ourselves. This is the first step, to get a sense for how the self appears to us, and then we investigate whether the self exists in the way that it appears. Because then we're not just engaging in looking for a theoretical sense of self, but actually how our self appears to us. So the first step then is to get a feel for how our self appears, and then look for this independent and unchanging self. So then the second step is this investigation. So let's take an illustration that's easy to understand. If we think of our form aggregate, our physical body, we know how much it's changed. We have some memory and we've seen the photographs, what we looked like as an infant and what we look like now. Vastly different. It didn't happen overnight. It happened over many years in between, and it happened continuously. We may only see it on a coarse level, but we do know from science the body changes continuously. The form aggregate changes continuously, moment by moment. Yet, this body that we so associate with our sense of self, the sense of self somehow seems independent of this. Somehow seems our sense of self to have been unchanging. But then when we look at our form aggregate, it has changed so much, momentarily. And not only that, but we feel that the sense of self is independent from this. So whilst we feel that the sense of self is independent from the aggregate and our sense of self is unchanging, what is it that we impute ourselves on? It is this form. Sometimes the consciousness, but it's often the form. I am sitting, I am traveling, I'm walking, driving. The sense of self imputed onto the I, onto the self, onto the physical body. But we're doing it independent. We impute the self onto the physical body. Yet, it doesn't appear as if it's dependent on the physical body. It appears separate from it. So this is the disconnect. So through utilizing this reasoning, and there are many reasonings we can apply, this reasoning is the reasoning of dependence arising, we can come to realize selflessness.
나는 아디 내가 풍보디 때는 여러배서나 다 풍보디래배서나 다 풍보디가 수기 풍보디가 말해 가서 내가 자고 막 가서 다 수기 풍보디 매바이네 나 여 자고래 배는 저기 지게 네 수기 풍부의 매와 차다 나대 차고 지상아 신의 깨와 치마다 지게 레유를 끼게 세다 미를 끼게 세다 나 산지 고방도 토야 여러 받아 지상아도 수부디 근데 나이나 수부디 뭐 신의 매와 쳐도 곧 매와 차도 고 지상디네 지상 나디 수부디데 민도 지상 수부 나와나지 나다 수부디 민도세 다 수부 매나 다 수부디 나마이나 다아주 소와도 베네다 디나이 가서 셈네 봐다 셈네 방아리베 가서네 수부디 매와 차베네 셈디다 개와 치마를 두고 ordine 개와 산지고 고방 토야다 안 차사데 가지고 넘버 쉐바디 균 두고로 와 진짜 넘버 쉐바디 가로 와서 인축으로 와서 디네 용고로 와 디네 인자다 가서 당보 수 삼다도 당보 다 가서 수부디엔데서 삼다 진짜 수부세디 대체당이 라바당 강바당 고당 또 전에 안 지기 난게다 샤당 차당 바바도 제바진 진짜 디스 차상 나힘 진짜 나세야디 수부디네 자고 있는 예미도 제바지야데 진짜 수부디네 예미도 제바지 다보 술때 다 술때 예미나 다는 가와요선 셈이때도 요치고로 가서 수부디 매바차나 셈디 개와 치마 두고로 와 아니 개와가마 두 개와 치마로 개와가마네 대용 말에 진짜 디 개와 치마 두고로 와 진짜 디 셈디 안 사요고만 토르고 진짜 셈데 가인 쪽으로 와 셈비게 삼릉구로 와 진짜 두스 당보 나주기 나세야디 수부디네 예메 제바치도 수부디네 민도 삼 제바치야 돼 그래서 수부디네 가인나 네 라바데 가인랍나 네 라바데 매바스나 네 지 매바 차베네 나요데는 라바 매바레시 네 디나시 안다 다 라바 가인랍네 라바 예바데 가래 연바데 가래 까바데 네 나망고 차르거든 미지래 아베 mamimo 차르고라 디나지 디네 섬단 디스 차상가 리미도 셈비게 제바치데 다 수부디네 이야미도 셈 제바치야로
First step of this meditation is to see how the self appears to oneself, second, or appears to consciousness. Secondly, is the investigation. So the second step, we can have an A and a B. And the first part then is to look for the self that appears to be independent and unchanging within our body, within the form aggregate. Because we do associate our body so very closely with our sense of identity, of our sense of self. When we think of ourselves, we often think of our body. Not only, we also think of our mind in terms of our personality, but we associate our body very closely with our sense of self. So if our body, our form aggregate, is our self, find it. The self that we've, in the first step, come to recognize as being independent and unchanging, let's find it within this form aggregate. So the first refutation we've looked at previously is we've seen how this form aggregate has changed throughout this life, but yet our sense of self didn't seem to change. We thought the self as an infant, the self as a young person, the self of now, we kind of think of ourselves as the same, but our form has changed so much. Well, let's try into our varying body parts, and we can think of our flesh or our bones or our blood or any of the body parts, or perhaps a limb. Does our sense of self reside in any single body part? And of course, quickly we can see that it's not, because let's say we wonder, is our hand our sense of self? Because we certainly refer to it as, this is my hand. But if we were to lose our hand, if we were to be amputated, we'd still have the same sense of self. We just would have one less hand. Or if we were to say, if the sense of self was this hand, but not that hand, that would be really strange. Or if it was both hands, we'd have two selves. So here we start to see some contradictions. That is the sense of self any one particular body part, such as the hand? Or is it a collection of body parts, and then we have a variety of selves? And we very quickly come to see that the self cannot be found anywhere. The self that is independent and unchanging cannot be found anywhere within the form aggregate or within a collection of the parts that make up the form aggregate.
나는 아디 당한도 두스 나응기 다 수불은 미야면은 다 나응 셰바 나라 삼다웨네 셰바 소와 대와디긴 아레벨라네 소와 대와디 메바이나 소와 둥원요 비갑라 가요레 제가 소와 대와디 용 말에 제가 가요 디아리미도 지사 초와 둥아 딩아리 이제 난 디하리면 가서 초와 대와 유비깔로 둥아리 요 말이 내 가요래 지사 초와 둥아다 대와제 가리면도 도 파제바치 당아서 넘버 쉐바세 넘버 쉐바 참모 디게다만 지동 아주기 다 지게 왕시에 차상가 이시바라고 차상가에도 넘버 쉐바 참모 들리고 넘버 쉐바 참모 대당 아인 식으로 와는 넘버 쉐바 참모 대양아 말이야 그래서 넘버 쉐바 참모 대가 있나 넘버 쉐바 참모 대야 기징아마디 나르베 니바레 지상 기징아마디 나 있나 기징아마네 가지 니마디 뚝뚝갑라 기징아마디 메바레 이네 나요레스 다 기징이바디 나 인랍나 아니 기징아마디 값소 기징이바디 요마 뚝유레시네 지사네 나요마레베스네 기징아메 값소 나요레 이네 기징이바요 마시다 넘버 쉐바도 제베네 기징아마단 치마디게 나 리두 제베네 넘버 쉐바 코론레 아니 넘버 쉐바 코론에 기징아마단 치마르 귀네 부티네 귀네 띠네 뚝뚝게지 기징 나마다 치마르 띠네 뚝뚝게지 지사 찌찌르 띠네 뚝뚝게지 제 넘버 쉐바 코론에 리민도 지사 디네사 또 삼단다 나세디 부제바제나 풍보다 다 수기 풍보 낭셰바다 강게 되네 자오기 예메바다 또 제다 간섬질래도 제바지 나세 자오기 두스니에마 동상하지 마도 메바 차용을 동상하지 마도 제자 두신 제바지도 감 진짜 당하세디 디지 가서 로라 나와나세 랑문도 두는 하세 자오기니 민도스베 되네게 나데 자오기 예민도스 많이 봐 동상하지 통고를 봐 되네게 동상도 통위기 로데라 안에 다음에 봐도 별로 하시고 나 저기 쌤 때도 되네게 다음에 봐도 별로 하시고 제가 되네게 다음에 봐도 별로 되기네 다 되네 두 통선디 제일야 가라하고 것은 당아세디 풍부한가 버지리 팔로에 봤다 봤음 뢰다 봤음지마도 자오기니 민두스다 뢰 봤다 봤음 많이 봐 뢰 봤다 봐 많이 봐 그런 원리 두든 자오기니 민가세디 봐 뢰다 봤음 지레샤스 하고 두고 그래 지나 되네 인자 다른 가세 자오기네랑 원리 두디가 갈라에 마도 뢰 봤다 봐 많이 봐 나한 그런 원리 두지 자오기니 민두아 선별로디 데디도 디삼 하고 한 뢰딜라 다 다음에 봐도 별로 없어. 돈이도 별로 라게 다음에 봐도 라고 그래서 디 다음에 봐도 별로 없어. 다디 공부 그래 저래.
I forgot to mention something in that previous section, so I'll conclude with that. So, when we're meditating on looking for this permanent, this unchanging and independent self within the form aggregate, we can't come to see that we cannot find it. And this is despite, though, that when death comes, we know we'll continue onto a future life. This is why we're training in spiritual progression, so that our future lives can continue to go well. We can eventually attain freedom from suffering and Buddhahood. And to do so, life after life, we will continue to acquire a new body, a new form aggregate. So therefore, in this form aggregate, there can be no self to be found. So that's the A part of the second step of the meditation. The first step was to see how the self appears. The second part of the meditation is the investigation. And this as an A, looking in the form aggregate. Now we come to the B. If we can't find the self in the physical aggregate, we look in the mental aggregates. Come to see if we can find our sense of self as being independent and unchanging anywhere within our consciousnesses. Consciousness, especially for those who've been coming to the weekend teachings, you'll know can be divided in a wide variety of ways. But just take one firstly, that of feeling. So feeling of happiness, feeling of suffering, or pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, neutral feeling. Is any such consciousness, our I, our sense of self? If it was, what would the consequence be? So let's say a pleasant feeling, if this was the I that appears to us innately, it would be unchanging and independent. If our sense of happiness was the I, it would be unchanging and independent, which means we would always be happy because it's unchanging. Always happy. Never slightly more, never slightly less. Always happy. We know this is not the case. And our happiness will be independent, not influenced by causes and conditions, or not influenced by anything at all. We also know this isn't the case. We experience happiness independent on causes and conditions. So therefore, the pleasant feelings, or the feeling of happiness, cannot be our sense of self. In the same way, we can look at any of our individual consciousnesses, or in the terminology of our weekend teachings, the mental factors, and we see that none of them are our sense of self. We aren't any of these consciousnesses. In this meditation then, one always comes down to, but what about the subtle primary consciousness? That subtle primary consciousness that goes from lifetime to lifetime, that went from this previous stream of continuity of lifetime to lifetime, now is present in this lifetime and will go on into our next lifetimes. What about that subtle primary consciousness? Surely that is the where the I can be found. So look there. We have the subtle primary consciousness that does go from life to life. But if our sense of I that's unchanging and impermanent is to be found there, it's being unchanging and independent, it would always be the same, unchanging, and not impacted by anything at all, affected by anything at all, independent. So where is this unchanging I in this primary consciousness? Because the primary consciousness is made up of innumerable parts, and those parts are individual moments of consciousness. The past moments, the future moments to come, and the present moment. So where in there would the self be found? Can't be the past moments, they're gone. Can't be the future moments, they're yet to come. So is it the present moment? And if you look for that present moment of primary consciousness that goes from lifetime to lifetime, that cannot be found because each moment can be further subdivided into a subtler moment that's past and is yet to come, past and future. And therefore a present moment cannot be found. So even here, we cannot find a self that is independent and unchanging. And this is where we come to realize that the self is empty of being unchanging. The self is empty of being independent. The self is empty of existing in the way that appears. This is where we come to realize emptiness. This is where we come to realize selflessness. And our consciousness that is realizing emptiness or selflessness here is a wisdom consciousness, a wisdom realizing selflessness, or wisdom realizing emptiness. And this wisdom then goes on now in the third step of the meditation. The third step of the meditation realizes, having realized that the self does not exist in the way that it appears, it then realizes that the self is merely imputed by mind onto the basis of the aggregates, onto the collection of the aggregates or any of the aggregates. The self is merely imputed onto the aggregates. And that's the third step of the meditation.
Da denegi jeba che chang ju gi do chine ta nga sa di da deshi denegi jeba che khaya me manye ba tong sa tong yong du ane gar je go sne gar ha go sne deshi yang zu lo na yong du gar nang go sne ga la ya ma do rang ngu ju tu ye ba na xin jin ju bi lo di da no ju yin ba da go ro no ju yin ba da go ji sa nga sa di da denegi jimba na je ga la ya ma do ba ko ngon ne ju ba zao ni mi do san bi ge min do se de dong de da dong bu yu di gar cha wo sne nga sa de ga la ya ma do ba rang ngu ni ju de ge dong bi ge dong sang di da dong ba ni di do be lo de la da dong ba ni do ba lo si go ra je de ne ha go ga dong ba de ha go lo de da de ne gi dong ba ni se de ga sa di phung bong ga la ya ma do rang ngu ni ju be dong sang de la ya mi ji ne na de la mi ne 신의 주 제 띵이 제 검제 다 신의 주 공고를 다 될미네 신의 주 검제 다 데니기 신행 안에 냠버샤제 안에 공부고래 제리다.
Gone through the meditation where the first step was seeing how the self appears. The second was the process of analysis, first looking for the self in the body and then in the B part, in the mind. We came to the conclusion in the third point that the self does not exist in the way that it appears. We came to realize how mistaken, how wrong this innate consciousness is, this innate consciousness that is an ignorance, that believes that this self exists in the way that it appears, exists in a way that's unchanging and independent. And this consciousness that realizes that the self does not exist in the way that it appears, but is empty of existing in that way, is a wisdom consciousness. And it's a wisdom that realized that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears. This is the wisdom realizing emptiness, or the wisdom realizing selflessness. When that arises, we abide with that realization. We rest with that realization, undistracted, single-pointedly. And we keep doing that. As each time we engage in this meditation, we come to this conclusion. Abide with it. And eventually, through training, we'll come to this realization of emptiness with a union of single-pointed concentration and undistracted meditation.
데니기 동반이라 미비 신이 줍제 데니 제집이 딩이지 제집이 딩이지 곰제 야곰이야 곰 나 데니기 곰 데네 가브리엘라 아니 데네 양 진비 냠레나 추림냐 수비 냠레 아니 존진 냠레제 양 데네 양 아니 동반이라 미 제집이 미비 딩이지 곰 양지 데니기 신이 양 디제레 양돼 양지 진바이나 추린 수비 냠레 나서봐 두시 림바 신도 곰제 공고로와 데네 곰여도 되네 저기 다시 말이 빠지 방고래 제 방투고래 제시고로다.
I encourage you to do this meditation regularly. And each time you come to this understanding, although it will be very contrived at first, but soon it will start to have more of a profound impact on oneself. Each time it arises, abide with it in a concentrated way. And thereafter, meditate on the other four key practices: ethical restraint, generosity, patience, and joyous perseverance. And then once again, meditate on emptiness. When you realize emptiness, hold it with concentration, and then again, ethical restraint, generosity, patience, joyous perseverance. Go through, meditate on these six sequentially. Because in order to realize emptiness, in particular the union of calm abiding, one needs a huge amount of merit, as well as to overcome other obstacles. And for this, one engages in these other reflections as well. So therefore, one does these 6 meditations sequentially.
동반이 미피기 동반이 또별로다 다 동이 또별로데 동이 또be 셔랍라 고라 동이 또be 셔랍다 동반이 미비 신행이리 순이를 끼기리란데 동반이 또be 셔랍데 니를 끼고래 지사 동반이 또별로게 근데 동반이 또be 셔랍게 처위 제라 된 동반이 미비 신이 주고고라 신이 주고고래 당보 동반이 또be 셔랍길게 동반이 또고라 동반이 또용도 동반이 또be 셔랍 끼고라 되네 신이
Of the sequence of the realization of emptiness and the realization of emptiness with concentration, first one realizes emptiness. Thereafter, one develops calm abiding. So there is this sequence.
동바이 시내리니를 시고로 삼대시고로 제자다 동바이를 미비에 삼된 되네 동바이를 미비 셔랍스라베네 디셔랍들 하동하래 동바이를 미비 하동하래 제자 디 아주 진바 추준서버 전제 삼된 셔랍시디 삼된기 제일이야 셔랍시야디 하동을 시고로 하동하래 제자 하동하셔야디 동바이를 미비 시내 줍찬에 당보 동바이 또 되네 동바이를 미비 시내 줍 Dene tombanyi lami shini drupchane, ta shini di ngane yangya jaba jeje ane tombanyi tobe sherab kiya chiyu chagore. De tomba tobe sherab tela shini ki drupne, shini ki di ngane tombanyi la jaba jeje, tombanyi tobe sherab tela ta lakdonga se gore. Cheza nga zuki jimba tsurin suba tsunde samse sherab se de di sherab di drukne sherab de ane sherab de lakdonga gore.
So to reiterate, one first will realize emptiness, thereafter concentration, single-pointed concentration. So first you realize emptiness, and only afterwards are you able to hold that realization of emptiness with single-pointed concentration. So there is that sequence. Now you may wonder, hang on, when I think of the sequence of the 6 perfections, it's always presented as generosity, ethical restraint, patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. So that seems to be the opposite. And that is because in the sequence of the 6 perfections, concentration that is followed by wisdom, that wisdom refers to meditative insight. So here, what this means is one first develops concentration and thereafter meditative insight. And some translators say penetrative insight, and others say special insight. Anyway, here, meditative insight. So this meditative insight, or wisdom, follows concentration. But when one is developing the wisdom realizing emptiness, first, that is realized. Secondly, concentration. Thirdly, meditative insight. And this is because when one first develops the wisdom realizing emptiness, then one holds it with concentration. Thirdly, one develops a union with meditative insight.
nga se di phumbo da gangla ya ma de khorong ni drup de yuo ni dre me de nga zulo le nang go de na wa na shin de ni du sam de yore sam be jimba de la da se mari ba se or da di nyong mo ba ge gi gyu zo di re da nga khoro ye zai yu gyu de gyu za wa du zo wa di re da ji san di mari da se mari ba se di na zo zai yu di ba da.
To remind ourselves of why we've been talking about this tonight is that we engage in this meditation so as to completely eradicate the root cause of samsara. Because it's through eradicating the root cause of samsara that samsara itself is destroyed. In other words, we become liberated from samsara, freed of suffering. And we recognized earlier that the very root cause of all suffering is the ignorance of self-grasping. And therefore, we engage in this meditation to develop the mind that is completely contrary to the ignorance of self-grasping, the wisdom realizing selflessness. This is the antidote to all suffering. Through realizing emptiness, we will be able to destroy the root cause of all the afflictions, and thereby no further afflictions will ripen, no further contaminated karma will be accumulated or ripened, and thereby one achieves cessation of all suffering.
무인이 수대 간심바다 하고 걸바다. 세상 되니 하고 해야게 되나다. 되니게 다신디 녀모 빠야 다신디 게디 빵와라. 나중에 나세 무인이 수기디 또 고거래. 세상 또 고바자. 다간 또베 탈람 가르레스네. 된디게 남자 삼다지 제바치 또 고래스네. 다 제바치다 당보 간에 제바치 고리 쓰는 중에 다 라바라바 삼다 당보는 아주 미다베 삼다지. 다 소소래 당보 나 소소래 삼다지. 나세 나 안에 네 아말레 때네 게 아는 아주기 대두세네 되네 아말레 느끼리 추주 마도요 말했어 나는 마 지난에 아미 깨와 좀 다가랑 유어기네 되면 집에서 내 레메도스 가선 되는 세다 아미 오마다 되네기스 뉴발에 되네 야 철철철 살로지 야야 철철철 차고도 나든 두진 나데네 두진 충충지마도 되네야 살로 두 철철네 당보 기여도 아니 기셰신요 말레갈레션 다도 순지 야야야 아니 지기 기셰신야데 레갈도 유어도 두도와 sabegeda 지사 나세디 강라 규다 kiến了 마되바지데 레민도 규다 kiến了 되네 두고도와 sabege 아주 미다베 삼다야지 제바제디 당보데체 단니바데 삼다야데 당아저 나세다는 가르레스타 간디시 두스 나세디 나저 단당보 나랑 소소로 ngồi 송고로 나세디 간디스 두스 지사 당아저 풍보를 파 요구 제네 풍보디 바서 조디갑라 안지지를 nga dugu ko dugu setting anzu phungbo la ta shi be di kap so nga se phungbo pha lue pha nga se phungbo pha ta gu du sambe samje ta ya ji mo chowa de ho ki de nga de ho de be ki bu du se be ki sam ta do di kap so phungbo la sam tang mu ka san chowa de la sam ta ji nga de bu du la do chowa de la ta gu du wa se san chowa de la ta be nga chi du ta ya gabriel ji ne ha go so ne thong so la chi shi de 디가부가 두시들어다 두실래야도 지산 두시들래 초와되기 시기면도 풍부하기 시기면 다 가르치고서 네디 하고 디제 디마레 네 하고 라도 두시가 레고 지산 다디가 두실 딱도 와 지산 디네 레도 지산 가 세대 다 돈다라 풍부질 풍부가 뭐 가르칠 파 따비기 따셰비기다 기부시 디네질 자와친질 나레샤 세베도 지네야 삼 니베데 삼다이 디네 차기도 와 디데데 나도 다디 제일 시기로데 다디 가르치에서는 미다베고 삼당하제 되네 nga 세데 nga 좀 nga ngwe 송타 지지래 되는 상아도 nga 가르치는 ngwe 송고래서는 nga 지데라 nga 두도 nga 디부도 가르치는 ngwe 송고선 되네 지는 ngwe 송고래서 디제바 제야지 봐
The way to realize selflessness is through the skillful technique of dependence arising. So now we'll briefly represent the meditation from earlier, but expand on the steps. So the first one, as we heard, is to meditate on impermanence. So impermanence, you remember, has two meanings. Everything that is impermanent, firstly, comes about in dependence on causes and conditions. Secondly, it changes momentarily. So this is the case for ourselves. We came about in dependence on causes and conditions, such as being born, but not only being born from our mum, but we grew up throughout this life, and that came about in dependence on a wide variety of causes and conditions. So we can see that. So we can see that we have changed a lot. And moreover, all this change has come about in dependence on causes and conditions. Second step then of the meditation is to see how the self, how do we, as ordinary people, how do we relate to the self? So how we relate to the self is to talk about, I'm sitting here, I'm walking there, I'm going here. And in this case, we impute self, by our mind, imputes self onto the form aggregate, onto our body. I am here, referring to my body, is here. The second way we relate to the self in the world is by our mind imputing self onto one of our minds. For example, I am happy. The sense of self is imputed on the mind of I am happy. Or it's imputed onto the aggregate of discrimination. I know this. I saw that. So we impute the sense of self onto the mental factor or the mind of discrimination. And we impute the sense of self onto that particular mind. So this is the second step of the meditation, is to see how in the world we refer to the self, and we see how we impute self onto the body and or the mind.
Somebody Julia, Danga, said in our Lulia, now you can snangudus. That Lul, now you can snangudus, do chevachi, cheva sometime. Just a Lola can snangudu sometime, chevachi do, and Zulolia, Nadi, and the Pumbota, Chashia, Galaya, Madiva, Korangon, Dudiva, Ruis Nangorda, Denish Nangudu, Denish Nangudua, and begin. That can snangudu some that chevachi, Denish Nangu about the Haukura, chevachi.
Then the third step is to see how does the self appear to us. The second was how we generally talk about the self. The third is how does it innately appear to us. And this is something independent of the aggregates, for example, independent of anything at all, not influenced at all. And secondly, unchanging. So this is how the self innately appears to us.
That Lola now and Hashindida, Nati Kalamadu Rangon to now and Hashindi, Nashing Hadida, Kawadu Sosugi, Pumbo to Pumbota, the nigger Semda, Garitin to Kanekane to Simpashim Juche, that the Chiba de Chagorwa.
And then fourthly is the process of investigation. If the self exists in a way that's independent and unchanging, it should be findable. It's unchanging, it's been the same throughout our lifetimes, and independent, not influenced by anything at all. That should be findable. And the place to find it's not out there in the world, but here within the aggregates. So look for it, first in the physical aggregates, and thereafter look in the mental aggregates. Try and find the self to see if it exists in the way that it appears to us innately.
Dinigi Jevache, that Jevache, Rimbadir, Jikdirochi, Dinigi, that Jevachi Lam Rim Text to us, the Kakurwa, Sinada in the Sosorangi, Dinigi, Jevachi La, Nielang to Luma Yusun Yejo Timbiku Tsurim Soya, and Jiga, Jigala, Lamata, Idamlia, Sodep Chede, and Sodep Chede, Sodep Chiada, and Jiganzo, Dikwashaya, Tikwasang Chea, Tizna, and the Chebupuya. So by Dinigi, Tony and the Duski Chiran, and to get the Jevachi or Esigur, that is a Sosa, Jipjang, Nico, Tsurimsun, Sosa, Jipjache, Dinichi Gilia, and Jevachi, and Duski Chigi, Jehores, and that Sosa, Jipjam, Majeba, and the Jevajan, some Danti don't eat the Dotuya, Galakabachagis, or you remain, Mesera, then it's a Sosa Jipjan, Jehores, and the Tsurimsoya, Sosa Jipja, Sebocomia. And also teacher and Yamlanangores.
And then the meditation, as we heard, concludes with the realization the self doesn't exist in the way that it appears. So that's the final step. But this realization then is difficult to come to quickly. Don't engage in this meditation after our class together and think, oh, I'm going to realize emptiness today. It takes a lot of training repeatedly over a sustained period. But not only that, it requires a lot of merit as well as a lot of purification. So therefore, it's my sincere hope you do engage in this meditation right from now, repeatedly over a sustained period, but include in that meditation, in particular, the meditation on ethical restraint. This is a crucial prerequisite. And if you can do the other meditations within the six, such as generosity and so forth, that's excellent to do. But you also, in addition to engaging in the meditation on ethical restraint, need to engage in purification of negativities, clearing of obstacles to our spiritual development, and the accumulation of merit through making offerings and so forth. And the final part to include at the outset of each practice and meditation and throughout one's day, supplications to one's Lama, to the Buddha, to one's Yidam, supplications for inspiration, for progression in our spiritual development for the sake of others. So thank you. Then we'll conclude here for tonight. Thank you.